Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime.
Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41.
That haunting melody is probably familiar to you if you were born in America and are of a certain age. Millions of children grew up learning the sing-song rhyme about Lizzie Borden, and most know this terrifying tale as the true story of a double murder over a century ago. On August 4th, 1892, in Fall River, Massachusetts, 69-year-old Andrew Borden and his 64-year-old wife Abby were found hacked to death inside their home. Their murders were brutal, shocking, and unheard of in the New England community of Fall River. Andrew Borden was a successful businessman who lived a quiet life with his wife and 2 adult daughters in a modest home. He was not ostentatious and had no enemies to speak of, nor did his wife. So who could have committed such a heinous act against the Bordens? The community was even more shocked to learn that the prime suspect in the hatchet slayings was none other than Andrew Borden's 32-year-old daughter, Lizzie. The crime and subsequent trial became a media sensation, and Lizzie Borden became infamous in the annals of true crime history. Over the next few episodes, we'll do a deep dive into the Lizzie Borden story to uncover who this mysterious woman was, the truth about the murders, and determine once and for all if Lizzie Borden got away with murder. This is the series, The Women Who Shaped True Crime, the tale of Lizzie Borden. On August 11, 1892, when the Fall River community heard rumors of a possible arrest, people began making their way to the city jail, hoping to catch a glimpse of the accused. But the city marshal, aware that a throng would soon gather, avoided attention by taking a side door and slipping quickly into a waiting carriage. His charge, 32-year-old Lizzie Andrew Borden, was whisked to the Bordenville train station to catch an afternoon train to Taunton, a town 15 miles away. There she would be booked into the Taunton City Jail for the double murder of her father and stepmother. By the time the train reached its destination, a crowd had already gathered in Taunton to witness Miss Borden's arrival. She stepped from the train dressed all in black, with a short black veil partially obscuring her face. She was flanked by Fall River City Marshal Rufus Hilliard and Lizzie's minister, Reverend Edwin A. Buck. She appeared calm. She did not speak, nor did she look at the crowd. She walked straight ahead into the entrance of the brick jailhouse, where she was met by Taunton Sheriff Andrew Wright. Sheriff Wright was handed the indictment against Lizzie Borden. Hers was only one of 3 arrests for murder in Fall River that year, and the only one of a woman. Lizzie was taken to the south side of the jail, known as the Women's Ward. After being instructed to bathe, like every new prisoner, she was escorted to one of 10 cells. 6 were occupied by women serving sentences for minor offenses like petty theft. Lizzie Borden was no ordinary prisoner. She was the daughter of a well-to-do Fall River businessman and was also a member in good standing of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. The Borden family went back 7 generations in Fall River. A week earlier, a brutal murder had occurred in their town. Lizzie's father, Andrew J. Borden, and his wife Abby were found hacked to death inside their home. It was a shocking crime, and rumors abounded that a foreigner or outsider had targeted the wealthy businessman. But when it was determined that no valuables had been taken from the home, nor did Borden appear to have any enemies, police began to suspect the attack was more personal. Over a series of days, Lizzie, Andrew Borden's youngest daughter, who was the only other family member home at the time of the murders, was made to answer questions at a formal inquest. It was the outcome of that inquest that resulted in Lizzie being arrested for the murders of her father and stepmother. The community could not believe that a good Christian woman like Lizzie Borden could be responsible for such brutality, and the authorities were swiftly criticized. The Women's Christian Temperance Union circulated a petition demanding Lizzie be released on bail, quote, 30 years of virtuous living should count for much in such a doubtful case, the petition writer stated. City Marshal Hilliard was roundly criticized, as was his police department. Quote, "I think the whole lot of you fellows better put your heads in soak. The idea of trying to fasten the butchery of Mr. Borden on his daughter and letting the fellow escape is outrageous in the extreme," one letter writer exclaimed. Another called the marshal, quote, "an asinine servant of the law," suggesting he be tarred and feathered. While the community members were expressing outrage at the accusations leveled against Lizzie, the district attorney himself was grappling with his feelings about charging the genteel woman with such a serious crime. D.A. Hosea Knowlton's correspondence with Attorney General Albert Pillsbury records his reluctance. Quote, "Neither of us can escape the conclusion that she must have had some knowledge of the occurrence," he wrote of the accused. "Personally, I would like very much to get rid of the trial of this case." But he conceded that he could, quote, "not see my way clear to any disposition of the case other than a trial." So how had Lizzie Borden, as unlikely as she seemed, become the #1 suspect in such a horrific crime? In 1892, Fall River was the third largest city in Massachusetts and a center of textile production in the state. The town was divided into two distinct groups: the mill workers, who lived in modest homes near the center of town or near the river, and the mill owners, who occupied more extravagant residences. The wealthy occupied more fashionable addresses on the Hill, where they entertained and hobnobbed with other members of New England's social set. These social soirees provided opportunities for the children of the privileged classes to meet and marry one another, continuing their financial legacies for generations. The Bordens were respected members of the community and had been instrumental in Fall River's founding and success. However, Andrew Borden, Lizzie's father, was viewed as a lesser Borden. He had not inherited wealth like the majority of his family members, and what money he did have, he'd earned himself. Lizzie's great-grandfather's brother, Thomas, was the beneficiary of the family inheritance. Thomas and his offspring became entrepreneurs. It was Thomas's line, including Andrew Borden's cousins, who became millionaires and entered New York high society. In contrast, upon his death, Richard Borden, Lizzie's paternal great-grandfather, left only $400 to his son Abraham. Abraham, Andrew Borden's father, made his living peddling fish. All he left to Lizzie's father was the family home on Ferry Street. Through hard work and wise investments, Andrew Borden grew his finances to become a man of means, although it was a pittance compared to the Borden's wealth on his uncle's side. Andrew Borden, born in 1822, started as a cabinet maker specializing in furniture and coffins. He lived frugally and invested in real estate, including farmland in Swansea, Massachusetts. Borden purchased property in Fall River and eventually built the A.J. Borden Building at the corner of South Main and Anawan Streets. Each morning, he walked to his office located in this building, which was only a block away. In 1845, Andrew Borden married Sarah Anthony Morse. They had 3 daughters. Emma was born in 1851. Alice Esther was born in 1856, but died before the age of 2. In July 1860, Sarah gave birth to her last child, Lizzie. Emma, 9 years older, became Lizzie's protector and doted on her. The two remained close all their lives. Their close bond would become crucial after their mother died of, quote, uterine congestion and a disease of the spine in 1863, when Lizzie was just 2 years old. Emma, now 12, became Lizzie's mother figure. 2 years later, Andrew Borden married a 37-year-old spinster named Abby Durfee Gray. At that time, a woman was referred to as a spinster if still unmarried by the age of 23. Lizzie and Emma would also be considered spinsters, as neither was married at the time of the murders. It was said that Andrew and Abby did not have great love, but they got along well. It was believed that Borden married Abby to have someone to care for the girls and run the household. Emma, who was 14 when her father remarried, resented the intrusion and would never refer to Abby as mother. Lizzie, still a child when Abby arrived, did refer to her as mother, but that would change as relations between the Borden women grew tense in later years. In 1872, Andrew Borden moved his family out of his childhood home and into a newly purchased residence on 2nd Street. By this time, he'd accumulated more than $250,000 fortune in cash and real estate, but boasted he'd never borrowed a cent. Borden had a reputation as a notorious penny pincher. If the Borden sisters hoped their father, who became a bank president, would move them to the Hill to live among their more affluent cousins, they were sorely disappointed. Andrew Borden purchased a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood at 92 2nd Street in the center of the business district. The neighborhood was occupied by primarily Irish and Catholic residents. The Bordens were Protestant, and as was typical of the times, didn't associate with others who were not white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. The 2nd Street house, formerly a two-family residence with separate floors for each family, was converted into a single-family home by Mr. Borden. It was narrow, just 20 feet wide, with no hallways, and each room opened directly into the next. There was also no privacy, no gas lighting, nor indoor plumbing. Borden removed the upstairs faucet, leaving only cold water sinks in the kitchen and cellar. He installed a flushable toilet in the basement, but the family was still dependent on chamber pots inside the house, which required taking them to the cellar for emptying. As the girls matured, they began to grumble about their living situation and lack of social standing. By the 1890s, Lizzie, now 30, and Emma, in her 40s, had not married. Whether this was by choice or lack of suitors has never been made clear. As a result, their fortune and opportunities lie solely with their father. The sisters occupied their time doing charity work, attending church, and joining women's organizations like the Temperance Union, where they campaigned against the sale and consumption of alcohol. Andrew Borden owned farmland in Swansea, about 5 miles north of Fall River. The family spent part of their summers there and sometimes visited relatives in other parts of the state, but that was the extent of their social lives. Their father, described as gaunt, humorless, and set in his ways, found entertaining frivolous. There was no room in their house to do much entertaining anyway. Mr. Borden found most non-essential purchases extravagant and a waste of money. Borden kept his wife and daughters on a tight budget. Abby received the same weekly allowance as her stepdaughters, $4 per week, or about $140 today. However, while Lizzie and Emma's allowance was considered pin money to use on whatever they wished, Abby had to pay for household expenses out of the same amount. Abby may have also resented that her husband valued his daughter's opinion more highly than hers. Andrew Borden was especially fond of Lizzie, his youngest daughter, and the one who shared his name. Her middle name was Andrew. Borden never wore a wedding ring, but he was delighted when Lizzie gifted him a thin gold band. He wore it for the rest of his life. Tensions in the Borden household boiled over in 1887, possibly setting the stage for the tragedy that would befall Andrew and Abby Borden 5 years later. Abby Borden's father left his house to his wife, Abby's stepmother, and Abby's half-sister, Sarah. Abby's stepmother wanted to sell her half of the property, but Sarah didn't have the means to buy her share and would be forced to move out. Abby appealed to her husband for help, and he agreed to purchase Sarah's share, allowing her and her husband to live in it rent-free. This uncharacteristic generosity on their father's part did not sit well with Lizzie and Emma. They complained bitterly about the arrangement, saying that anything he did for Abby's family, he should do for his own children. To appease them, he transferred the house he'd inherited from his father to his daughters, adding that they could even keep the income the house generated as a rental property. Still, they were unsatisfied, and Lizzie especially resented her stepmother for, quote, unduly persuading her father in their arrangement. From then on, Lizzie stopped referring to Abby as mother. She became angry if anyone referred to Abby as her mother, and pointedly corrected them, saying she was her stepmother. Lizzie said even more about her stepmother to close acquaintances, calling Abby a, quote, mean, good-for-nothing, deceitful, and a two-face. Lizzie and Emma began ignoring Abby and even refused to eat with her. The Borden's housemaid, Bridget, reported being required to serve 2 meals because the sisters refused to eat with their parents. Perhaps to mollify his daughter, Andrew Borden gave Lizzie an extravagant, out-of-character gift. To mark her 30th birthday, he paid for her to take an 11-week grand tour of Europe, accompanied by other unmarried female acquaintances. However, once she returned, Lizzie was even more frustrated with her life. She'd had a taste of the fine living enjoyed by other women of means and resented being stuck in the flats of Fall River with no money to spend. Money and valuables began to disappear from the Borden home. In June 1891, while Andrew and Abby were out of town, the house was broken into, and jewelry and cash were taken from a locked desk. Lizzie, Emma, and Bridget had remained in Fall River during that time, but didn't recall seeing any strangers entering the house. When the police arrived, Lizzie immediately led them to a screen door, where she pointed out her suspicions that it had been forcibly unlocked with a small nail. When Andrew Borden was interviewed about the crime, he only thinly veiled his suspicions that his youngest daughter was responsible for the theft. He commented that the thief could have only entered through Lizzie's bedroom. 3 times he expressed to the police, quote, "I am afraid the police will be unable to find the real thief," end quote. He then called off the investigation and attempted to keep the story out of the newspapers. From then on, all the doors in the house were locked with keys. Andrew Borden locked his bedroom door daily, keeping the key on the mantel in the sitting room in plain sight, as if daring someone to use it. The Borden's bedroom door connected directly to Lizzie's room. The front door of the 2nd Street house was triple locked, even while the family members were home. Each person locked and unlocked their bedroom doors and bureaus repeatedly throughout the day. This made the home very secure, but it also created quite an inconvenience for the residents. On August 2, 1892, Abby Borden crossed the street to visit the family physician, Dr. Seabury Bowen. She told him that she and Andrew had been ill and believed they'd been poisoned. After questioning Abby, the doctor suspected the couple had eaten some bad fish. Andrew Borden was known as a skinflint, who often made his family eat leftovers 2 or 3 days in a row to avoid waste. In the middle of the hot summer, food tended to spoil quickly without the convenience of modern refrigeration. The Bordens were often afflicted with stomach complaints, and the good doctor assumed this was once again the case. Andrew Borden had expressed as much to his wife that morning, but Abby said that it, quote, felt different this time. At her insistence, Dr. Bowen accompanied her to check on Andrew, but he turned him away, retorting that he didn't need a doctor and wouldn't pay for the visit. That night, the Bordens ate a meal of mutton stew. Mr. and Mrs. Borden again fell ill, but Lizzie did not. Emma was away visiting relatives in Fairhaven. After dinner, Lizzie visited her friend Alice Russell and shared an odd story. She told Alice that her father and stepmother had fallen ill, and she suspected they'd been poisoned. Lizzie said her father had enemies that may be out to do him harm. Alice asked her for details, but her friend remained vague, saying she couldn't offer any more than that. Lizzie ended the conversation by saying, quote, "I feel as if something is hanging over me that I cannot throw off, and it comes over me at times no matter where I am. I don't know, but someone will do something," end quote. The following morning, a woman entered D.R. Smith's drugstore on Main Street and requested 10 cents worth of prussic acid. Prussic acid is an odorless, colorless, fast-acting poison. Here's an interesting fact. Prussic acid, a diluted form of hydrocyanic acid, was an ingredient in the cyanide-based pesticide known as Zyklon B. Zyklon B was most infamously used in Nazi Germany's gas chambers to exterminate approximately 1.1 million people. When the druggist inquired why the woman needed the poison, she answered it was to be put on the edge of a sealskin cape. The druggist refused her request, stating that prussic acid could only be obtained with a doctor's prescription. The woman argued with him briefly, but left empty-handed. Later, the druggist would identify the woman as Miss Borden, Andrew J. Borden's daughter, Lizzie. The following day, Thursday, August 4th, 1892, started as a typical day. Emma was still out of town visiting relatives. Andrew's brother-in-law, John Morse, a frequent house guest, had stayed overnight in the upstairs guest room. Early that morning, Bridget Sullivan, the housemaid, awoke feeling nauseous. The day had already begun to grow warm and would soon become oppressively hot. This did not help her mood, but she dressed and headed downstairs to prepare breakfast for the family. At 7 a.m., Mr. and Mrs. Borden ate breakfast together. Soon after preparing a meal of cold mutton, mutton soup, Johnny cakes, coffee, and tea, Bridget went outside and vomited. Her boss and his wife also became ill. However, a short time later, they all got on with their day. Around 8:45 a.m., their house guest, John Morse, left to visit some friends across town. Just moments after his departure, Lizzie ate a light breakfast of cookies and coffee alone. At 9:15 a.m., Andrew Borden left for his office. Around the same time, Mrs. Borden told Bridget to wash the windows outside the house. Still not feeling 100%, Bridget reluctantly set about completing the task before the day grew even warmer. Now only Abby Borden and Lizzie were left in the house. Around 9:15 a.m., according to Lizzie, her stepmother said she was going upstairs to make the bed in the guest room. At 10:45 a.m., Andrew Borden returned home. It's speculated that he may have come home early because he was still feeling unwell. Others say it would not have been unusual for him to pop in and out during a workday, since his office was a block away. However, this detail is a matter of debate. We do know that Mr. Borden could not open the front door as it had been bolted from the inside. He called to Bridget, who struggled to unlock it while her boss waited outside. She uttered an exclamation in frustration and heard Lizzie laugh. She looked up and saw Lizzie descending the stairs from the front landing. Mr. Borden entered and, after taking the key from the sitting room mantel, took the back stairs to his bedroom. A few moments later, when he returned downstairs, he was greeted by Lizzie. He inquired about his wife, and Lizzie answered that a note had been delivered to Abby regarding a sick friend, and she had gone to visit them. Her father then settled on the sofa in the sitting room to take an afternoon nap. After letting Mr. Borden in, Bridget had also gone to her room, located in the attic, for a nap. Bridget had Thursday afternoons off and decided to begin her rest period early due to the heat and because she was still feeling slightly ill. Sometime later, Bridget was awoken by Lizzie, who cried out, "Come quickly!" As she reached the first floor, Lizzie told her, "Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." She sent the startled housemaid to fetch Dr. Bowen and their neighbor, Alice Russell. Left alone, Lizzie stood looking out at the street behind the screen door. Her neighbor, Adelaide Churchill, saw her and called out a greeting. Lizzie stood frozen in place, so Mrs. Churchill came closer and asked if she was all right. In a quiet voice, Lizzie answered, "Oh, Mrs. Churchill, do come over. Someone has killed Father." Dr. Bowen soon arrived and entered the house, leaving the women outside. He entered the sitting room to find Andrew Borden lying dead on the sofa. Dr. Bowen would testify that Andrew Borden's face was, quote, badly cut and covered with blood, but that his body was, quote, lying apparently at ease, as if anyone would if they were asleep. Crime scene photos show both of Borden's feet still planted firmly on the floor, while the top half of his body lies prone on the sofa. His hands rest in his lap, and no injuries or blood are visible on them. However, his face and head are all but obliterated, and a great deal of blood covers his chest. The medical examiner would determine that Borden had been hit at least 10 times with a hatchet that struck him with great force. The blood still flowed freely from his wounds, leading the examiner to conclude that he was killed just moments before his body was discovered. Shaken, Dr. Bowen left the Borden house to send a wire to Emma instructing her to return home. Mrs. Churchill phoned the police. While they waited, Mrs. Churchill asked Lizzie where her stepmother was. Lizzie said she'd had a note from a friend and gone out. "Where were you?" Mrs. Churchill asked, likely wondering how Lizzie had escaped becoming a victim. Lizzie said she'd been in the barn, quote, looking for a piece of iron to make a fishing sinker. She claimed she returned to the house upon hearing a strange noise. By now, neighbors sensing the commotion began to gather in front of the house. They'd witnessed the doctor running back and forth between his home and the Bordens. They also observed the housemaid Bridget, who seemed to be in a state of panic. Bridget was indeed very distraught upon learning of Mr. Borden's attack. She continued to inquire about Mrs. Borden, saying someone needed to locate her quickly. Lizzie then remarked that she thought she'd heard her stepmother return and go upstairs, a very different version of what she'd reported moments earlier. Mrs. Churchill asked Bridget to accompany her upstairs to locate Mrs. Borden. Bridget, terrified, didn't want to go, but she also didn't want to refuse the woman's request. She walked behind Mrs. Churchill as she began ascending the narrow staircase. Mrs. Churchill only had to walk up a few steps to view the second-floor landing. There she saw Abby Borden's body lying face down on the floor in the guest room. She cried out to Dr. Bowen, who rushed upstairs to her aid. When the doctor reached Abby, he didn't attempt to turn her over, for he could tell she was already dead. Blood had congealed around her head, and she was cool to the touch. He guessed that Mrs. Borden had been killed sometime before her husband, as the blood was already sticky to the touch. Mrs. Churchill and Bridget returned to Lizzie and Alice Russell. Alice asked, "Is there another one?" Mrs. Churchill replied, "Yes, Abby has been found." Lizzie responded oddly, "Oh, I shall have to go to the cemetery myself," she remarked. When the police arrived, they noted that Andrew Borden had been hacked to pieces, although there were no other signs of disturbance in the house, and nothing seemed to have been taken. They examined Abby Borden's body. It appeared as if she'd been struck from behind, while her back was turned toward the door. They determined she'd been hit with a hatchet, approximately 18 or 19 times in total. The murder weapon was nowhere in sight. Investigators found the crime baffling. Andrew Borden had no known enemies, so revenge didn't appear to be a motive. They also ruled out a botched robbery, as nothing had been taken. They immediately suspected that the motive for the murders was personal. Mr. and Mrs. Borden had been slaughtered. Both of them had been viciously struck multiple times, undoubtedly many more times than necessary to kill them. The crime appeared deliberate and fueled by rage. Bridget and Lizzie were home at the time of the attacks. Investigators surmised that Abby had been killed shortly after she'd gone upstairs to the guest room, around 9:30 a.m. According to their timeline, Mr. Borden was most likely attacked about 90 minutes later. The front door and cellar door had been locked all morning. The front door was also bolted. How could the attacker enter the house in the first place and then remain unseen for that length of time by either Bridget or Lizzie? The only other entrance to the house was the side screen door, which was in sight of where Bridget was washing windows all morning. And why hadn't either of them heard anything? Police believe that the sounds might have been too muffled by street traffic for Bridget to hear, who was outside of the residence. The second street house was on a busy street. But they couldn't understand why Lizzie reported hearing nothing. Investigators even theorized that Mrs. Borden, who stood at 5 foot 1 inches tall and weighed close to 200 pounds, would have, quote, shaken the floorboards when she fell, alerting anyone inside the house. Police noted that the door to the bedroom where Abby was attacked remained open after her murder. Bridget reported seeing Lizzie on the landing just opposite where Mrs. Borden's body was discovered. Why hadn't Lizzie noticed her earlier? Photographers were called to the scene and took the still famous crime scene photographs depicting the bodies just as they were found. The house was searched thoroughly. In the cellar, 3 hatchets were found in a box behind the chimney. One had a freshly broken hilt, and the handle was missing. The hatchet was covered in ash, leading investigators to wonder if it had been washed and then put in the ash to dry. They began to suspect that the murders were an inside job committed by someone close to the Bordens. They started with the surviving residents first. John Morse was quickly ruled out as he had a concrete alibi. Several witnesses testified he was across town at the time of the murders. Bridget Sullivan was seen outside of the house by neighbors during the time Mrs. Borden was attacked. Lizzie herself provided an alibi for Bridget. She said the housemaid had gone up to her room soon after Mr. Borden returned home. Emma Borden had been visiting relatives in Fairhaven and only returned after learning the terrible news. The Borden murders soon became a media sensation. with local newspapers and even the Boston Globe reporting updates in their morning and evening editions. Hundreds of curious people gathered in front of the home night and day, and tongues wagged. The initial reaction by community members was that an outsider, read immigrant, must be responsible for such a violent act of murder. They speculated that a Portuguese, Swede, or Chinese laborer was angry with Mr. Borden over wages or other dealings. Bridget Sullivan's name was also bandied about as a suspect, with some pointing out that she was Irish and Catholic. Also, as a, quote, working-class woman, some theorized that she was strong enough, despite her slight build, to wield an axe in a deadly fashion. However, as previously stated, investigators quickly cleared her. Even Dr. Bone was suspected and was rumored to be Lizzie's secret lover. This gossip had floated about the community 4 years earlier. The doctor had accompanied Lizzie to church one Sunday while the rest of her family was at the Borden family farm for the summer, and this had caused quite a stir. The day after the murders, Lizzie and Emma Borden placed a notice in the Fall River Herald offering a $5,000 reward to anyone who could provide information leading to an arrest. They also hired a Pinkerton detective to aid the police in their investigation. Strangely, the detective only remained in Fall River for 2 days before concluding his inquiries and leaving town. Investigators soon zeroed in on one suspect, Lizzie. They found her demeanor odd, and her accounting of her activities the morning of the murders contradictory. When Deputy Marshal John Fleet first questioned Lizzie soon after the murders, he noted she seemed strangely calm and detached. After inquiring if she had any idea who could have killed her father and mother, she answered, "She's not my mother, sir. She's my stepmother. My mother died when I was a child." He found this an odd response in light of the situation. Officer Phil Harrington had taken detailed notes at the crime scene, including his interview with Lizzie. Quote, "Lizzie stood by the foot of the bed and talked calmly and collectedly. Her whole bearing was most remarkable under the circumstances. There was not the least indication of agitation, no sign of sorrow or grief, no lamentation of the heart, no comment on the horror of the crime, and no expression of a wish that the criminal be caught." End quote. But there were two specific details that raised red flags for the officers. One was a report from the local druggist, who upon hearing of the murders came forward. He reported Lizzie's visit to the drugstore the previous day, requesting to purchase poison. Then there was the issue of the note. Lizzie claimed that her stepmother had received a note from a sick friend and had left the house that morning. However, no note was found, and no one came forward to identify themselves as the note's sender. Clearly, the story about the note was a lie. 2 days after the murders, on Sunday, August 6th, the Borden's funeral was held. A private service attended by about 75 people took place in the Borden's sitting room. 2 black-draped coffins lay within feet of where Andrew Borden was butchered. The coffins were then taken by carriage to the burial ground. Over 2,500 people lined the streets, leading from the 2nd Street home to Oak Grove Cemetery to glimpse the funeral procession. While the grieving family members attended the funeral, police searched the crime scene. They pulled up carpet pieces, removed wall trim, and counted blood spots. After the funeral, the caskets were left unburied. The police had ordered undertakers not to bury the bodies, but to have them transported to the morgue, where autopsies were to be conducted. Lizzie, Emma, and their house guest, John Morse, continued to stay in the 2nd Street house. Although police had searched it for evidence, including cracking open Andrew Borden's safe to search for a will, they oddly did not search either Lizzie or Emma's personal items. Women's items were not searched, as this was considered improper in polite society. On Tuesday, August 9th, a formal inquest was held at the Fall River Police Station. An inquest was required by state law at that time in cases of violent or unexplained death. District Attorney Hosea Knowlton conducted the inquest. Bridget Sullivan was the first person to take the stand. She was a cooperative witness, giving a detailed timeline of the morning of the murders, beginning when she made breakfast and started her chores, until the time she was awoken by Lizzie's cries that her father had been killed. Bridget recalled seeing Lizzie pass through the kitchen that morning around breakfast time, but she could not give an account of her other movements as she was outside washing windows until Mr. Borden returned home. Immediately after her interview ended, Bridget returned briefly to the 2nd Street house to gather her things. She never returned to the Borden house again. Next, Lizzie was questioned. In contrast to Bridget's straightforward account, Lizzie's answers were often vague and rambling. She brought the family attorney, Andrew Jennings, with her to look after her interests. Lizzie remained calm and unemotional during her interview, but stonewalled and provided contradictory answers to the district attorney's questions. In short, her story didn't add up. She was brought in as a crucial witness, but soon became the prime suspect. Knowlton pinned down Lizzie's location during the period when Mrs. Borden was killed. She admitted that she'd been home, but now contradicting what she'd told several witnesses, that Mrs. Borden had received a note and gone out. She now said that she'd last seen Abby when she went upstairs to make the bed in the guest room. Previously, Lizzie claimed she'd been downstairs all morning, but now told the DA she had gone to the cellar to gather laundry at one point. She also added an entirely new story about where she had been between her father's return home and his body's discovery a little over an hour later. She recalled that she'd gone to the barn to look for metal to make sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip, which would explain why she had not seen an axe-wielding intruder. When it was pointed out to her that it wouldn't have taken an hour to complete this task, Lizzie added that she'd stopped in the yard to pick some pears from the tree before heading into the barn. She said she spent at least 15 to 20 more minutes in the barn, quote, looking out of the window and eating some pears. The DA interrupted his questioning to offer his theory of her ever-evolving timeline of events. Wrapping up his questions about her trip to the barn, he said sarcastically, quote, "You have put yourself in the only place, perhaps, where it would be impossible to see a person going into the house." But when Knowlton asked Lizzie to explain the particulars of the trouble that she had with Abby 4 or 5 years earlier, Lizzie's answers were straightforward and to the point. She said she'd found out about her father's arrangement with Abby's sister to purchase her house from a third party, not from her father or Abby. She was upset that her father, quote, had been persuaded by his wife and confronted him about it. "I said that what he did for her, he ought to do for his own children, so he gave us grandfather's house," end quote. She admitted there had been a rift between her and her parents since then, and she had stopped referring to Abby as her mother. However, an interesting detail emerged when Andrew Borden's brother-in-law, John Morse, was interviewed. He testified that Andrew had spoken to him about making a will a year earlier. Borden's business manager, Charles Cook, also reported Andrew's intentions to make a will. Police searched for a will, but one was never found. Did the sisters catch wind of their father's plans to make a will? And did Lizzie worry she would not inherit his money or property? Witnesses also reported that Abby Borden said on several occasions that she stood to inherit, quote, valuable property, but what exactly she meant by this is unclear. Lizzie also flatly denied ever having visited the drugstore in an attempt to purchase poison. But 3 witnesses testified seeing her in the drugstore the day before the murders. Finally, it appears she tried to throw the police off her scent by offering alternate suspects. She told them of 2 suspicious characters she'd seen, quote, skulking around the house the previous winter, and again, just days before the murders. She also mentioned a man who was angry with her father for refusing to rent him property. Investigators checked out these stories, but could not corroborate them. In the end, the police and prosecutor concluded that Lizzie Borden was the only one with the motives, means, and opportunity to commit the murders. On August 11th, she was charged with the crime and booked into the Taunton jail to await trial. In next week's episode, I'll explain the details of the prosecution's case against Lizzie Borden and give you an inside look at the infamous trial of the century of 1892, in which Lizzie faced a capital murder charge. Questions we'll attempt to answer include, if Lizzie Borden committed the vicious hatchet murders, where was all the blood evidence? Was it possible that she was innocent? Or alternately, did she hire someone to kill her parents? I'll share details you've never heard before about this infamous case. Then you can decide, was Lizzie Borden an infamous murderer, or was she innocent? That will do it for part 1 of the tale of Lizzie Borden. To listen to the next episode early and ad-free, become a Patreon member. You'll hear episodes before anyone else, and gain access to 3 bonus episodes each month and other members-only content. Go to patreon.com/onceuponacrime to find out more and join. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia, and my researcher is Emma Battaglia. Until next time, be good to one another